All right.
All right, here we go.
Okay.
Z93 Jams, Charleston's home for hip hop and R&B, turned up radio shows. Time for the topic of the day. As I said, I've been promoting this man all week. I'm excited to have him in here today because he's going to give us perspective of some things that you probably didn't know about the history of this state and overall Black history. Being this the last day of Black history, I couldn't think of no one better than my brother, Damon Fordham, the author, historian, to come in and talk about all things African-American history, Black history here on the last day of Black History Month. How you doing, sir?
Well, I'm great, but I'm glad you brought it up. But even though it's the last day of quote unquote Black History Month, that doesn't mean that we have to stop doing it on February the 29th. We can do this all year because we are here all year and making history every day aside from February. So we can do this as long and as much as you want.
Well, I tell you what, man, one thing I love is just the way you bring forth stories is amazing. And it gives it a great connection to us. Sometimes with the attention span and things is just we're really not locked in. But I love I guess the way to say it is you make it intriguing and engaging to lock into the history, especially here in South Carolina, that you probably wouldn't know.
There's several reasons for that, actually. One is that too often in the academic field, you have people who get too deep into what my good friend, Dr. and mentor, Dr. Henry Louis Gates, who does the Finding Your Roots shows on Tuesday nights. Mm-hmm. He and I had dinner on one occasion. He told me to stay away from what he calls that pretentious academic gobbledygook. Like I was talking to this lady the other day from one of the New England states, and she was going on asking me about BIPOC and Latinx and all that. I'm like, real people do not use those words on the ground level.
Correct.
You have to speak so the average person can understand you, or all you're doing is just showing off. So my whole thing is to give it to the people in a language that they can understand, in a way that they can understand. So there's real teaching and not me just showing off by parading my vocabulary.
Absolutely. Now, I don't think I asked you this even the last time you were in here. Kind of what got you into so much to go so deep into our history and make this basically your life?
I'll give you the short version of that.
Okay.
Well, my dad and both my parents were from that period where the elders sat on front porches and told stories about their experiences. Love it. I grew up with that. Then you also had in those days Ebony Magazine, which did a lot of stories by a man named Lerone Bennett, who wrote fascinating stories about Black history. Mm-hmm. And two that I remember in particular were about the Black heavyweight champion Jack Johnson, who was Muhammad Ali's role model, mm-hmm. as well as the great nationalist Marcus Garvey, who encouraged us to look toward Africa as our homeland. Mm-hmm. So I got into all of that. And since I was very bad at sports and very awkward, I read a whole lot. Okay. And the things that I read about then are the things that I'm basically making a living speaking of now. And then when I went to the University of South Carolina, Dean Willie Harford of the Black Studies Department, he basically taught me that I could make a living from my interest in these things. So here I am.
Well, that's it's a beautiful thing. And one other thing I don't think I asked. So were you born and raised right here in Charleston? Or?
I was born in Spartanburg. Okay. And I was put up, Spartanburg, South Carolina. I was put up for adoption as an infant because that was back in the days when families didn't go for their daughters having out of wedlock children and such. So they put me up for adoption, and I was raised down here. I grew up in Mount Pleasant, and I inherited my parents' house, so I still live there. Why leave if you're going to inherit a place where all you have to do is pay taxes and upkeep, right?
Absolutely.
So I grew up. So I'm basically a Charlestonian. I grew up here, but I've been all over the place. My parents.
So what year did you actually? Would you say you came to the Low Country?
Oh well, I was born in 1964, and I was near the end of 1964, and I was adopted in 1965. So pretty much all my life.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. And I know it's amazing how different it is today from back then when you came up. I'm quite sure it was still dirt roads and things like that, because I remember coming down here, probably in the 80s, and like there was no 526 and things of that nature.
Well, yeah, but one of the things that we had in those days on the black radio stations, especially on Sunday afternoons after church, I would listen to orators. They would have the sermons of Dr. Martin Luther King,
Wow.
Malcolm X, along with the Reverend C.L. Franklin, Aretha Franklin's daddy. They would broadcast his sermons from Detroit, and they would have the Muhammad Speaks show with a very young minister, Louis Farrakhan, and people like that. So I was attracted to oratory at a young age, and I would get in the mirror after I would listen to these guys. Even before I understood the substance of their message, I loved the way they would speak as orators. So I would practice in the bathroom mirror with gestures and speaking to the audience. So that planted a seed. And while we're on that subject, I want to say this. One of the things, I know you're going to ask me about Africa later, but one of the wise men I met at the West African Cultural Center in Dakar in Senegal, West Africa, Dr. Ousmane Sene, said something real powerful to me along those lines that relates to all this. He said, a wise man plants a seed and knows that they will not live to sit in the shade.
Nice.
In other words, you don't expect children to get these kind of things right away. But when you plant that seed in them, you wait till they're old enough to fully understand what you're talking about, since you put that seed there. And then when they grow, they will take what you taught them and take it to the next level. Because anyone who's a parent or a teacher may have had an experience with a child coming to them and say, I remember when you told me such and such, and I didn't understand it then, but now I do. That's key in all of this.
Well, I guess that's the root of some of the challenges we have in this country, because people don't grow up with or should I say, they wasn't born with hate and divisiveness and things of that nature. But just as you said, you plant those seeds right there. So if you're planting negative seeds with some of the stuff that seems to be spilling over into our society and into our politics, that's making it real challenging today. Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree with that wholeheartedly, because what's happening is that you have a lot of young people of today who grew up in the days of the post-crack era and who have not grown up with the whole village system, in which the elders of the community, if they saw you smoking or heard you cursing and so forth, they'd let you know right away that that is not acceptable, and they would take it to your parents, who would in turn reinforce what those elders said. So those wise elders who passed down all that folk wisdom and all that, they died out largely around the period that the crack era came and just devastated so many of our communities, along with the building of highways through a lot of our communities, or as James Baldwin once put it, urban renewal equaling Negro removal, so to speak. And all of these things have had their impact on our community. And that's why those of us who grew up in the era where we had wise guidance have a duty to plant those seeds in the minds of the young. So hopefully in a future date, they will get what we were trying to teach them and then act upon that to see to it that we have better communities.
With Damon Fordham here with us, author, historian, sharing some Black history thoughts and obviously giving us some education on just the way things were at one point in time to where we are today, and so much more. So I want to get into so much and try to do it in such a short amount of time. Before I get into your Africa trip, when it comes to the history of Charleston, or the way they're making CRT into this ugly term, which I just put up a post that said CRT is inclusion, not exclusion. And the way they're trying to take our history, or just even the rhetoric that goes on to suggest Black people are connected to the former president because of sneakers and things like that, it's very offensive. How do you feel about what's going on and how it connects?
Very simple. First of all, what most people think is critical race theory is not real critical race theory. Critical race theory in reality is a very wonky academic concept dealing with how African American history is viewed through the lens of the legal system to explain the legal system. It's one of those things.
And not to cut you off, but when you say through the lens of some white folks too, because they feel like they're being targeted as, evil people and things of that nature that you hear in this.
Well, I was going to get to that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I was going to get to that.
Okay.
But anyways, I was about to tell you, it's basically a concept of using the history and the law to explain the inequities of the legal system. But unfortunately, a lot of my fellow academics don't know how to translate things into layman's terms that the average person understands.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's such a dense concept, CRT is not Black history itself, as some people are making it out to be. It's not. It's this that legalized concept. But since these people don't really know how to break it down to the average person, the people who are opposed to anything near this can go to the people and make it out to be what it isn't. Mm-hmm. And these people who twist and demonize that concept, they know how to communicate with their base. Mm-hmm. So when they go out and misrepresent it, the people who really know what it is have a difficult time trying to explain to the people, no, that's not what it is at all. It's actually this. But when they start talking, they get into that heavy academic way of speaking, which is lost on the average person. And the opposition knows that, and they're taking advantage of it. So that's it in a nutshell.
Okay. Well, I know with a lot of the way things are presented today, it feels like we're going backwards. What's the way to counteract some of this stuff that it feels like some of these politician TV hosts are okay with stereotyping Black people and what our most concerns are, and that is materialistic stuff and not the essence of what we look for in a political leader and such. I mean, have we gotten away from our core values, or are we not speaking out like the way our people from the civil rights era did? Or it feels like we're losing our way and we're just allowing things to creep back into our society now or into our culture.
All of the above, because you see, a person who understands what was has a better understanding of what is and a good idea of what will be if things are not done.
Correct.
To avoid repeating that. So let me break it down to you like this. All right. So so first of all, the reason that you had Africans in slavery in first place was because a Spaniard named Father Bartolomé de Casa suggested to Columbus that he replace Native American Indian slave labor with African labor. Okay. And one of the ways to keep that going was to convince the larger population that it was okay to do this, to lie and say that these people were somehow subhuman. But this also served another purpose. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, said before Congress in 1859 that the beauty of slavery was that it created white unity. In other words, their deepest fear was that the poor whites would link up with the Blacks over the plantation owners that oppressed the whole South in those days. So to prevent those two groups from coming together, they convinced the poor whites that if Black people had equality, that the poor whites would be pushed at the bottom of society. In simple terms, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. And that's what racism is all about, Charlie Brown.
Well, we're here with Damon Fordham, the author and historian on the Turned Up Radio Show. What I find it amazing, even back then, there was fear tactics used to try to divide.
Definitely, because you see, you also have to understand, I think I might have talked about this the last time I was here. You had the Reconstruction era after slavery, where the federal government tried to reform the South by passing the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, the 14th Amendment that made us citizens in 1868, and the 15th Amendment in 1870 that said that we had the right to vote. Okay, when we get that in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So with all of this, you began to see Blacks in political positions. You had Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, who was the governor of Louisiana in 1872 and 1873. Alonzo Jacob Ransier, who was lieutenant governor of South Carolina from 1870 to 1872, and Richard Howell Gleaves, who was Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina under Governor Franklin Jacob Moses, making this the first time that you had a black lieutenant governor and a Jewish governor. That's from 1872 to 1877. But the poor whites of the South just couldn't deal with that. So the wealthy whites of the South did not want to see this happen because they knew that this would be the end of their rule. So again, not only did they brainwash the poor whites against their best interests, in Pulaski, Tennessee, on December 24th, 1865, 6 Confederate veterans gathered at the courthouse to create the Resistance Army against Reconstruction. They named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. And as another great radio host used to say, and now you know the rest of the story.
I love this guy right here. If we could stay just there for one more question, during that time. So, when it comes to the Reconstruction, prior to Reconstruction, Abraham Lincoln wanted basically, or I don't know if it's the best way to say it, didn't really have a plan for African Americans, what have you, and wanted to send them outside of the country.
All right. Go
ahead. Speak to it.
That's just half the story.
Okay.
Because see, people nowadays love to deal with absolutes.
Okay.
That they like to freeze people in certain areas to serve their own purpose. Okay. There was a point where Lincoln was talking about deporting black people because he didn't feel that we could live in equality. But one person who he struck up a relationship with was the great Frederick Douglass,
yes,
who just as 100 years later with John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King helped wise Kennedy up to the need to help end segregation. Frederick Douglass wised Lincoln up to the idea that we should have equality in this country. So it was Douglass who convinced Abraham Lincoln not only to have black troops in the military, but because of Douglass's influence, Lincoln's last speech on April the 11th, 1865, called for black people to have the right to vote as well as send their children to public schools. John Wilkes Booth was in the audience when Lincoln made that speech, and 3 days later, when Lincoln went to the Ford's Theater to watch a play with his wife, he was assassinated. I always tell people the worst places you can get your history is Hollywood and the internet. You're best going off to the library.
There you go. That's pure facts coming from Damon Fordham, author and historian, sharing some black history facts with us. One last question in regards to all of that. I always ask this question when you bring it back to Black Wall Street, for that, using that term, if you will. Do you believe that black people were better off segregated?
No. And I'll tell you why.
You cut me off there. So
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I love that, though, because that means
because I was a little boy during the tail end of segregation, okay? I know what it is to drive with my parents to New York and pull over on the side of the road to sleep in your car because no hotel will take you, all right? So, no. See,
and so you don't agree with the fact that in regards to segregation, we found our way better, or again, that's why I'm bringing up Tulsa, in a way that we didn't rely on anybody but ourselves. I mean, can you adopt that notion, or is that still like...
That's a gross simplification. Let me break it down, okay? Right. Number one, I was a boy after desegregation, okay? And even when I was starting to go to the desegregated school, you still had in Charleston in those days the Brooks Motel, the Danny Martin's law firm, the various restaurants like the Ladson's House and Alice's Restaurant, Mr. Morell's Shoe Store, the Hotspot Record Shop, Honest John's Record Store, and all these places. That stuff still existed. There was no reason why with desegregation that the people had to either abandon those businesses, or the people whose parents ran those businesses, the children, that there was no reason why the children couldn't take on those businesses and continue. You could have two things at the same time. The problem with all of that was this. Number one, it's true that you had a more cohesive community in those days.
Okay.
That much is true.
Okay.
But you see, what happened was not so much the issue of desegregation. It was the issue of, number one, the freeway system and all of that destroying a lot of our neighborhoods, and the rise of this negativity in the culture with crack cocaine and us foolishly following the ways of the hippies and all of that, turning our backs on the teachings of our elders and that sort of thing. It was a combination of those things that helped make a poisonous situation with the community and all that, to where we lost our way. So it just so happened that a lot of these things happened to coincide with desegregation. Okay. Now back to the issue of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. What a lot of people don't get about that story is this. Yes, along Greenwood Avenue and all of that in Tulsa, you had all these black businesses. Okay. That much is true. But what's often the narrative that's often put out there is that the white people just came and destroyed it and woe is us. No, 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 no. There was more to it than that. You see, what happened with Tulsa was that a man named Diamond Dick Rowland was seen running out of the elevator after a young white lady was screaming, right? So they locked him up, and the surrounding white community came to the jail to lynch him. But what's not often told is that a Black World War II veteran named Obie Mann led a crowd of Black World War I veterans to the jail, armed to the teeth, to try to fight them off. And so when they asked Obie Mann, what are you going to do with that gun? Obie Mann said, I'm going to use it. And the battle was on. As a matter of fact, there was a fellow by the name of Pegleg, I can't remember his full name, who was a Black World War veteran who went up on a hill shooting at the people who were trying to come in to invade the black community on that occasion. All right. These are from surviving accounts such as Tim Madigan's book, The Burning, which tells the story of the Tulsa Massacre, along with surviving accounts of black people like John Hope Franklin, whose father, who I'm going to get into in a minute, plays an important part in the story, okay? John Hope Franklin was the great black historian who was born in 1915 and died in 2009. After the black community was burned out, B.C. Franklin, a black lawyer who was John Hope Franklin's father, he sued to prevent the city from taking the burned land of the black people and taking it for themselves. He sued and went to court, and he won the black people's right to get their land back. The black people rebuilt Tulsa, that part of Tulsa, into something better than they had before. So much so that in 1926, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, the co-founder of the NAACP, he went to Tulsa and he wrote in the NAACP's crisis magazine, Tulsa, I bow my head to you. That's the part of the story that isn't told, because you see, so many of these narratives often focus on gloom, despair, and agony on me. And if you look deep into it and read and go beyond what you're told on the internet that often plays on the misery of the people, you'll find a whole lot more to the story.
That's Damon Fordham right there, author and historian on the Turned Up Radio Show. We're going to take a quick break, and we come back. We want to talk about his trip to Africa, and that is what I desire, and hopefully you do too. But we'll get the details from him to see the rich history and what we could partake in if we take that trip over there. So stick around for that and much more with historian, author Damon Fordham right here on the Turned Up Radio Show with Z93 Jams. There, come back. Z93 Jams is Charleston's home for hip hop and R&B. Special treat in here to close out Black History Month, but obviously it goes on well beyond there, as Brother Damon just said. So we appreciate you taking the time to be here today. You gave us, you're just a wealth of knowledge that's just blowing me away. And hopefully it's giving people a perspective and understand the importance of why we got to dig beyond the surface of the knowledge that we're taught. Now, I did want to ask you one thing before I get into what's a good, is it a good term to say pilgrimage to Africa?
Sure.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, where do you think we lost our way? I'll just put it out there simple as that.
I just explained that a few minutes ago earlier. We lost our way by listening to a lot of bad advice and the whole cultural revolution that was happening in the late 60s and early 70s, where granted, there were some things that needed correction as far as how the elders dealt with us back in the day. But you see, people have a bad habit, especially now, of thinking in terms of absolutes. They throw out the baby with the bathwater. And the proper way to deal with cultural change is to do as Bruce Lee, the great martial artist, once said, you keep what is good and reject what is bad. That wasn't done. A lot of people just rejected everything that came before and embraced things that were not always in our best interests. The lax attitude toward drug abuse, the lax attitude toward the family system and personal responsibility and things like that. All of those things, along with some of the outside factors that we discussed earlier, that is the rise of drug abuse in the communities and things like that. These things were a combination of things that helped ruin things with a lot of our communities, you see, and have caused a lot of people to lost their way, plus the fact that the wise elder generation largely died out. And so one of the things that I try to do is to plant seeds among the younger generation of the good things that were passed down to us, but still learning from the mistakes of some of the bad things so that we can have a very balanced equality of how this works out.
So were we, I mean, obviously I feel like we failed our great grandparents, our grandparents, depending what generation you're from. Were we reprogrammed? Like,
yes.
How did we lose? Well,
again, it was a lot of the popular culture of that period. Basically glorified a lot of the turning of the back of the good traditions as well as the bad of the elders. And again, like I said, just earlier you asked me about Lincoln, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, this is how people think in absolutes, in that just because Lincoln was one way earlier in his career, people say, oh, well, forget Lincoln. He didn't do anything good, blah, blah, blah. But then they forget that people evolve as they grow. The classic example being Malcolm X. You know, people would be furious if you just limited Malcolm X to his days as a young man who was acting thuggish and getting in trouble. He evolved. Guess what? Humans do that. That's why I'm so dead against the idea of people canceling people and all this other garbage like that, because you don't allow people to grow. And the fact is, everyone grows. I definitely do not speak the way today that I did when I was 5 years old in 1969. I grew. Yeah. And so no one speaks the same way as an adult as they do as a child. Because as you become an adult, you put away childish things, right? So allow people that grace to grow. See, this is the kind of bad advice and wrong teaching that has affected our youth and why we have to step aside and say, hey, hold up, there's another way.
Nice. This is great stuff. Damon Fordham, our guest today inside the Turned Up Radio Show for the topic of the day, closing out Black History Month, even though we know it goes well beyond that. He's an author, and as you can hear, definitely an amazing historian. So let's talk about your Africa trip. I know it means a lot to you.
It does.
It means a lot. And I see the glow in your eyes and in your face when I just mentioned that. Now, first, I'm going to ask you, was this your first time over there?
I've been to Africa twice, and I'm planning to go again within the next year or so.
And would you encourage everybody?
Not everybody. No.
Okay.
Not
now
everybody.
Why is that?
Because everything is not for everybody.
Okay.
Because you see, there are differences in culture and things like that not everyone is ready for. Because I know good and well that I was at a state in my life where I was mature enough to handle a lot of what I saw in West Africa. Everything is not for everybody. You see, again, we make these mistakes in generalizing things for people. Marcus Garvey himself, the main reason why a lot of us started going to Africa in the first place, said that some people won't do a whole lot of good here and won't do a whole lot of good there. It's not for everybody because, again, you see, what should happen is this. Those of us who have the mindset and the ability to handle being in the differences of that culture, who are open to learning new things and all of that, it's up to us to come back here and educate the people who will not have the means to go and to educate them on the mindset over there so that if they choose to do that. But again, see, there's no one solution fits all for all people because we're all different. And that's not the role of everybody to go to Africa and come back and do all this. That's for those of us who understand these things to do that or who are willing greatly to learn to do those things. Some people go there with the wrong mentality and make a mess out of things.
So you think you got to mentally prepare yourself?
Oh, yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. So speak to, like,
And
why
now
you
here's
say
what I mean
that.
by
Okay.
it, because you see, there's still so many people who still to this day don't know that you have advanced cities in Africa, that Africans are a diverse people, or just the basic things. I had a barber once who was cutting my hair, and I was telling him, he told me he wanted to go to Africa, and I said, which country? And he goes, huh? I said, which country? What do you mean? I want to go to Africa. I said, there are 56 different countries in Africa. They are? See? You see what I mean? And then you also, to this day, you have people right now who don't know how to separate the facts from the foolishness on the internet. And a lot of our young people are wrongly brainwashed by the false prophets of the internet that we didn't come from Africa. We were some indigenous Americans before they came here, before the Native Americans, and that the whole thing with African slavery was a false narrative. And they're on the internet convincing our young people who don't have anyone better in their lives to teach them at home or go to the type of school where they learn these things, who are falling into this foolishness. We see, but I understand why that's so. In times of crisis, false prophets do well. So that's why those of us who went to Africa with an understanding of all of that and could bring that understanding to them, that's our role.
So your most recent trip over there, I've heard you speak about it so many times. What was different this time than the last time, and what did you take away from it, and how do you summarize the whole trip in a few minutes?
Before I get into my most recent trip, I want to talk very briefly about the first one.
Okay.
When I got off the plane, and the gentleman who was our guide there, Sekou Kasama, he came up to me and he asked me, "Are you the professor?" And I said, "Yes." And so he bowed and, "Salam alaikum, my brother. I am Sekou," and so forth. And when an African tells you salam alaikum on African soil, it takes it to a whole different level than when you get it over here, especially when that's your first moment on African soil. And as we drove through to Dakar, which is the capital of Senegal and one of the largest cities in West Africa. And you drive through the freeways and the skyscrapers and the universities and all these places in West Africa. Now, I knew before I went there that you had modern cities in Africa. But when you go through and you see these huge modern cities with all of our conveniences and and so forth, and to see that there's nothing but Africans running these things, not just their whole city, but their whole country and their whole section of the continent and so forth, it opens your mind up to the possibilities and kills the inferiority complex that so many of us are raised with here, being 1/12 of the population.
Wow. Stigma would say that they were behind the times.
No, they're not. Not entirely. Just like with anywhere. You see, again, people think in absolutes. You have areas that are advanced in Africa, and you have areas that are not. But even in the jungle, the people that I met in the rural areas still had that village mentality, where the adults of these little villages were passing things down to the young. They were doing manhood and womanhood, initiation ceremonies and all that. And everyone had their place and order and so forth. It was a very orderly society. And when you sit down with them and they welcome you by beating the drums and feasting and dancing and so forth, that is such an amazing feeling where you get when you see the richness of the ancestry of all of these things, and then that they're welcoming to you. There are people who are extended family of mine now to this day that I keep in touch with on a regular basis.
Great. Now, when it comes to your modern or most recent trip, what did it change in you?
Well, it made me see what it is to live life as somebody who's in the majority of the society instead of somebody who's in a subset of a society. You see, it's like when if you see a person misbehaving in West Africa, okay? It's not like here where people go, "Oh my goodness, what are white people going to think? Oh my!" It's none of that kind of stuff. You say, well, that's that person acting foolish. okay, that doesn't necessarily really reflect on me. Okay, you have that freedom to see that sort of thing in West Africa. And when you're in the majority, you view things with a whole different mindset than you are when you were in a minority within a country. You see, it just totally changes your mindset. And then I met people who knew who their ancestors were as literally the descendants of kings and queens and such, who could tell me, well, this was my great-great-grandfather, he was a chief, or this was my great-great-grandmother, she was a queen, and so forth. And you see it in the way they walk and the way they carry themselves. When you go into an African university, do you know that when you walk into a library in an African university, you will see thousands of students and nothing but complete silence? Do you know that when you walk into an African classroom as an instructor or a lecturer, as I did when I spoke to the students at the University of Gambia, that the students stand when you get up to speak? And speaking of which, I told the students there that people lie on you and say that you are an outside world and say that you are uncivilized. But the way my delegation and I have been treated since we've been here, I could tell you that whether we were in the densest of jungles or whether we were in universities like this or meeting with officials, the way the people there treated us had more civilization in their pinky fingers than many of us do in our whole bodies over here. So never let people tell them that you are uncivilized. And I promised them, when I get back to America, I'm going to tell the truth about Africa. And that's one of the reasons I'm here.
Do you feel that when you were over there, you had any sense of them wanting to adopt the Western culture?
Oh, yeah. That's more with the young.
Okay.
Because the young people, they watch a lot of music videos over there.
Okay, I figured it was.
And so you have a lot of young people who are getting into that whole thing with the hip-hop culture and even some of the more negative aspects of it. And I tell them, no. You have your beautiful traditions here. I tell them, listen, take our technology, but keep your culture and remain who you are.
Do you think if again, as you spoke about generations dying off, if they were to continue to adopt that without people in their ear saying, hey, there's limits to this or however, that it would change for the worse?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you see what's happening here, right? Again, as I said earlier, a person who knows what was understands what is and has an idea of what would be if certain patterns keep going, you see? So that's the last thing I would want to see in West Africa, because they have this beautiful tradition called the griots, where you have individuals, even before they had the written word over there, they would memorize the history of the kings and the queens and the villages and the tribes and so forth. And they would designate young people who they would pass that down to do that through the generations. I sat with some of the griots. In fact, some of the stories I got from them will be in my next book about the Black folklore of South Carolina. And it was just such a wonderful experience. It reminded me back in the days when the wise elders would tell me stories about the family going back to the days of slavery and stories about my ancestors and so forth. This was, I saw the continuation in that. And one of the things that I do in my work is to try to encourage a continuation of that, because I told you I was born in Spartanburg, right? A man named Dwayne Pruitt wrote the first Black history book of Spartanburg, and he closed the book by saying that the way to kill off the Cherokees was for the young Cherokees to not listen to the tales of their elders, and that would truly kill off the Cherokee nation. The same is true with us.
Wow. Well, when it comes to this trip and the book that you recently authored, is there anything that you took from there that's a part of the book, or what is the basis of this book compared to previous books?
Basically, it deals with how that African tradition of rich storytelling and passing on history and all that, how it affected us in South Carolina, even in some of the stories that were once told. Because you see, the current generation did not grow up at the time when the wise elders sat on porches and passed down the family history and all. Because in a lot of families, you had the elders, when they would start to talk about these things, would say, go away, this is grown folks talk. And so in doing that, I mean, I understand that there's some things that are not appropriate for the ears of young children, but in the process of that left a lot of our history to be lost in the graveyards. You see, I was fortunate in that when the elders that I grew up with saw that I was interested in these things and I'd like to listen to it, I did. And so the things that they told me then, I'm talking about now to keep that sort of thing preserved, and so that the current generation and future generations can learn from that.
Nice. So let me ask you this: when it comes to the Atlantic slave trade in Africa, there are tales that say they really only took from those who were on the coast. Can you speak to that, or let me actually add this onto it? And are there any signs in modern day Africa of what was such as what we have here, what little bit we have here in regards to the market and things like that?
Oh, definitely. I was at Gorée Island, the Gorée Island slave ports for one such place. That was one of the major slave ports of West Africa that the Portuguese built in the 1400s and was a slave port until the 1800s when the British got out of the slave trade business. I was there with our group, and it's a very harrowing experience. They march you through the cells and pens in which people were kept, and you go through what's called the door of no return, which is the door where they marched you through on a plank onto the slave ships. Now, this was my second time going to that, and along with me was a young lady from right here in Charleston who's probably listening to this right now, named Phyllis Holmes. I know she wouldn't mind me calling out her name like this, but myself and another young lady on the trip were the only ones who had been to the door of no return before, and I was very concerned about how the group would react to this. So after she did her walk through that, I asked her how she felt, and she told me these words that I want to share with the group. She said that she always wondered what her ancestors saw and smelled and heard and felt as they were being marched through that door. And she said that now that she had walked where they walked and saw what they saw and heard what they heard and smelled what they smelled, she said, I feel a sense of closure and I feel whole. And I said, you took the words right out of my mouth.
Nice.
So that's one of the beautiful things about Africa. Nice. And then to get really deep with you on this, many people over there, they said that I was of the Wolof tribe of Senegal and Gambia because of my facial features. Because just like how if you're in James Island or someplace like that, people can tell you're a Singleton or a Ravenel or a Gibbs or something like that by your facial features. That's how the Africans know who you are, right? So I was introduced to this young lady named Kaidiba, who is a young college-age guide at the museum in Dakar. And if you follow my Facebook page, this young lady can pass for my younger sister or my daughter because of our facial features. And she was able to tell the story and so forth and such. And we remain in touch to this very day. In fact, I talk about her in the book. But get this, I found out before I left on that first trip that not only was I connected to these Wolof people, but the Wolofs were the storytellers and the guardians of the history of that part of West Africa. So I come through this honestly.
Well, it makes sense. It really does. I love it. I love it. Well, these are some great details that you've shared. I mean, I'm really moved by the plank story, if you will, using it in those terms. And that's what I always wanted to embody. Just if I could have a moment to feel what it must have been like and how scary it must have been, and the way you just didn't know what was to come next.
Right.
And I think, as Miss Phyllis did, I think that would help a lot of us out. And now you saying what you just shared definitely is something that I would have to mentally prepare myself for.
Yeah, but see, again,
I don't know if I can handle that right off the rip.
Well, granted, if you walk out of that with a dry eye, I'd wonder about you. But see, it's as important in Africa as Auschwitz is important to Europe, you see, and the Auschwitz concentration camps. But you see, you have so many people right now that are so far removed from that to appreciate that as of yet. So that's why it takes a lot. Well, yeah, because, as again, you have a lot of people who really don't know this history to begin with, or who still think that Africa is nothing but primitive and jungle and so forth. And, the elder, again, I said that we should take the good of what the elders taught us, but also have enough sense to reject where they were in error. Because one of the things that the elders used to say back in the day was, I ain't lost a thing in Africa. And Malcolm X was correct when he went there and came back and said, we left our minds in Africa. You see? So as Frederick Douglass, one of the great freedom fighters, said in 20th Century of the Emancipation in 1883, that we have so much to learn, but yet so much to unlearn. And that's what us teachers are supposed to help with.
Good stuff right there. So to close, let's bring it back across the water. And obviously, Charleston has such rich history with obviously all of the sometimes I have to pause to make sure I use the correct terms, but the sins of this country. I'll just put it that way. I think that's a clean term.
Just say what you got to say. I'm not into all that PC nonsense.
But, because I'm on the radio, and you talk about this all the time and how much you despise it, how sensitive things are these days in regards to, if nothing else, speaking truth to power.
That's all you got to do. Just tell the truth. I mean, you don't have to curse, but I mean,
Correct. So, there's so many amazing stories you told on this show years ago in regards to Charleston that people just don't know. Like I said, the soil we walk on, I want to make sure I respect it to the utmost to know really what this city really means to us in our history.
Definitely.
So with all that said, what can you share with us that maybe people don't realize that plays a big part in the city we live in, that if I could use the term, that we disrespect just because we're somewhat removed from that time?
I wouldn't say that we disrespect it, because
Okay.
you can't disrespect what you don't know.
Okay, fair point.
But my favorite would probably be the fact that many people talk about how the great Robert Smalls, when he was in slavery, he sneaked his family aboard the Confederate ship, the Planter, and sailed into freedom.
Yes.
What most people don't know, that when he was a representative during Reconstruction, it was he, over at where the federal courthouse is now on Meeting Street, they had a convention of 76 blacks and 48 whites who got together to reform South Carolina for Reconstruction. And one of the reforms came from Robert Smalls on a speech he made there on January 23rd, 1868, where he said that resolved all children in South Carolina between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school at least 6 months a year under penalty of noncompliance. That was the foundation of the public school system of South Carolina.
Wow. See, I've never known that, because I only know.
Well, the reason why you don't know that is because a lady named Mildred Rutherford, back in the early 1900s, with the Daughters of the Confederacy, they edited things like that out of the history books used in classrooms and replaced it with Confederate history. Those books were in our classrooms until 1984 in South Carolina. But you see, Mildred Rutherford and people like that knew that the average person knows only what they are told. And you only have a handful of unathletic, weirdo bookworms like me who will go deep into the libraries and dig up these kind of things. But it's the responsibility of those of us who do, people like myself. One of the people who was helped me with my graduate degree, Dr. Bernard Powers, who used to be at the College of Charleston, Dr. Marvin Delaney, who's now in Austin, Texas, Dr. Henry Louis Gates, who does the Finding Your Roots show and all these documentaries and things like that. It's the responsibility of us who know how to do this research to get it out there to the average Jane and to the average Joe, because as Malcolm X said in a speech in Los Angeles in 1962, you could never do anything unless you know you did anything.
Beautiful. I love it. The great Damon Fordham, author and historian, thank you so much for taking the time to share so many great stories as well as facts about our rich history that we have, that again the classrooms won't teach you about. And before you go, I want you to share the information on where people could connect with you, maybe if they want you to come speak at their event and things like that. What are the best ways to connect with you?
Okay, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, and Twitter under my full real name, Damon L. Fordham. You could get in touch with me via that. If you're at a situation where you can pull over in the car and write this down, my email address is damonfordham1964 @gmail.com. I have a YouTube channel, which you're probably going to see this on, called The American Storyteller. I keep it simple so that people could remember that.
Yeah.
And my books are available at Buxton Books, 160 King Street downtown, where I do a walking tour called The Lost Stories of Black Charleston, as well as Barnes & Noble and all your other bookstores. You just go to the bookstore and ask for things under my name, and if they don't have it there, they'll order it for you.
Great. That's great stuff. Look, thank you for always taking the time to come in and to enlighten and educate us. It's essential, as you were speaking about it. That's what I use my platform for, to make sure we raise awareness and elevate our minds to a lot of things. I don't want to use the term, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe that's hidden from us, or maybe we're not seeking it,
all the above.
Way.
You can't look for it if you don't know it's there.
Correct. And so for people like you that are willing to take the time and do it and to share in the wealth of knowledge you have, it just blows me away every time. I always look at your YouTube channel, always follow you on Facebook, and I could sit here for hours and just listen to you tell the stories. I don't know too many people, or really technically anybody, that could do it like you. So I just wanted to give you your flowers for all that you do for our community and to raise awareness.
May I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
It's part of a process, because when I was a boy, I would listen to on the black stations we had there. Earlier I told you how I used to listen to Dr. King and Malcolm and Adam Clayton Powell and the Muhammad Speaks show with the young Minister Farrakhan, as well as the Reverend C.L. Franklin and leaders like that. You see, when people like that went on the radio, there would more than likely be some young person out there that would plant a seed in, you see. And so it's my hope that when I get up here on the radio to the young people who are listening to this, something I said here would plant that kind of seed that will grow and encourage the next generation to continue to do something constructive.
Absolutely. Well said. Well, thank you for taking the time. I was going to ask you, is there anything else that you wanted to share that you did not share, that you felt that was on your spirit, that you needed to share? Because, it's a lot, man. It's a wealth of information here. But or any final thoughts outside of that? Because I could have.
No, that was my final thought.
Yeah, because I was like, that was great right there within itself. So Damon L. Fordham, the author and historian, on the last day of Black History Month, as he emphasized, it goes well beyond this day. But we need to continue to engage and to seek the information that is relevant, that's prevalent, and that will actually help build the next generation. And I think we all have a responsibility to do that. And I thank you for what you do.
You're welcome.